I am your moderator for tonight, but that is official as of maybe 2 hours ago. So I'm going to do my best with you all. Hi, everybody. I am not Naomi C. I wish she could be here tonight. I know she wishes she could be here tonight as well. So you're stuck with me. I am Alexis Mercedes Rinck, your Seattle City Council member. But tonight, your moderator for a really exciting and interesting discussion that I know I'm going to be really excited to dig into these questions with our two panelists for tonight. So we're here tonight to really examine a notable trend that's happening right now in Washington politics. As Democrats are approaching a near supermajority in Olympia, we're seeing an uptick in Democrat-on-Democrat primaries. That reflects some deeper debates about the party's direction, both nationally and locally, and I know we're all feeling it. The group chats are on fire. So tonight we're gonna be exploring some of this intra-party challenges surfacing right now, from local pressures like housing affordability and zoning to public safety, to also some generational shifts that are happening, demographic changes, all in the context of our broader national polarization that's going on. So we're gonna dig into the mechanics behind them, from fundraising and donor networks, labor and business influence, endorsement dynamics, grassroots organizing, primary rules, and how turnout will be shaping outcomes. So looking at these real policy differences at stake, we're going to talk about branding, moderate versus progressive. We're going to consider challengers as a part of a broader movement or a collection of local insurgencies, looking at risks and benefits for democratic governance and electoral prospects, and talk about how these fights might change legislators' behavior and party strategy in Olympia moving forward. And so, we're going to dig right in. Right now into the race I know everybody's talking about. In Seattle's 43rd Legislative District, Senate Majority Leader Jamie Peterson, architect of the millionaire's tax, faces a millennial labor organizer challenger, Hannah Sabiel Howell. And similarly, right across Lake Washington, we have Rep. Amy Wallen in Kirkland, who drew a primary challenger after voting against the millionaire's tax. And these contests show different framings between performance and purity politics. So my question to our two folks for tonight, to kick us off, in one sentence each, what is the core message incumbents are running on in this cycle? And what is the core message of their intra-party challengers and they're running on?
Can I go first?
Sure. I mean, I'll answer the question that incumbents should be running on. I wouldn't say that all of them are, but you know, the question or the message that they should be running on is that we're a fighter, we stood up to Trump, and that we're Trump-proof in Washington. That's the message that they should be on. Now, most of them are too stupid to do that, and their consultants, if they didn't hire me, are too dumb to do it. But yeah, that's what they should be doing.
Yeah, I think that's actually about right. I would add, I think the message they are running on, for the most part, is mission accomplished. We promised progress and we delivered it. I think there are some challenges with that, but that in one sentence is about the message I think most of them are running on. I'll dive into then the second part of that question, which is the message that a lot of challengers are sort of sharing, which is what progress? We look around at rents that have doubled, at childcare that costs the equivalent of a college tuition, and a lot of our friends choosing between putting food on the table and paying for health insurance. And we're rightly, I think, questioning, what does that progress look like and for whom? And this is a really hotly debated part, but that I think is the core of the message. Tied to as well, if they had good ideas for how to solve those problems, they would have done it already. And that, I think, is sort of the core message across the board for most of the challengers.
Mm-hmm. And Dean, do you want to touch on the second part?
Yeah, and I honestly think there's a generational divide in a lot of these races, not all, but many. You know, there's like this perception that the old establishment isn't getting it done, but then I also think that there's this interesting parlay with national politics. And that Democrats are incredibly frustrated with the Democratic Party. And I think this has to do more with what's happening in Washington, D.C. than what's happening here. You had all of the nonsense around the 2024 election, Biden's mental health, his performance, him getting out, Harris running, Harris losing, Trump coming back. But it goes even deeper than that. It goes all the way back to Democrats not standing up on the Supreme Court nomination, or several of them. It goes to the Democratic performance in Washington, D.C., or lack thereof. I think we're all frustrated with that. And that's playing out across the board in all races, whether it be, even here in Washington State. And I think that Democrats being frustrated with the Democratic Party is fair, and it's a just criticism, and, people should be criticizing. If they think back to Trump 1, Nancy Pelosi was a hero, Chuck Schumer was a hero, like our leadership were heroes. And going to Trump 2, we're like, can anybody identify the sound of Hakeem Jeffries' voice? Like, I don't even know if the guy knows how to speak. And, they're not standing up in the way we want them to.
Yeah, I think I'll just add real quick.
Yes.
Whatever. I'll just add some thoughts to that as well, which because you touched on this point, which is the Democratic Party today is the most unpopular it has ever been in my lifetime, and a lot of other people's lifetime.
Right up there with data centers.
Like, legitimately. And it's not just that Republicans pretty much hate us maximally, like that hasn't increased. Like their hate is already capped at the highest you can hate someone. And independents, like us about as little as they can throw us. But really the difference is Democrats don't like ourselves. Like, we are in the midst of a real identity crisis about what it means to be a part of this party. And I think we'll get into this more tonight, but like, there's a social interpersonal fight happening here, and that is driving a lot of this. Like, we don't like the policy outcomes that are coming out of our party. There's a growing salience that our party serves not a general interest, but the interests of a handful of small, either wealthy individuals or businesses or special interests, whether they're labor unions or advocacy organizations. There's a sort of general growing salience around the idea that, does this party serve us as a broad set of people, or does it serve an elite that we are losing touch with? And the final piece I wanted to add to that, because you talked about this generational element, which is that my generation is the first to really be substantially worse off economically than our parents. Like, the idea of buying a home in the city of Seattle, me and my partner both make, 6 figures, like, it's still off the table, right? And that's not just me. I'm not like, oh my God, woe is me, the consultant in Seattle. The point is that our generation is feeling so disconnected from being able to find a future that is financially stable, that we can build a good life in. And I think that's a real, like, fundamental problem that the party hasn't quite figured out how to talk about yet.
I mean,
now you both touched on
one pushback on that is that 30 years ago, when I was president of Young Democrats of Washington, a couple blocks away, and had a few less gray hairs, we were saying the same thing. So we figured it out. But that being said, I understand the frustration. You're not wrong.
Well, you've both brought up pieces just around the generational divide that's happening within the Democratic Party. And I want to dive into that a little bit more, because you mentioned there was the obvious component with the 2024 presidential election. I'd be remiss if we didn't bring up the Mitch McConnell of the matter that we're currently in. And so there are some real questions, but I think we can all agree that with age can come, is there a Mitch here? With age can come expertise and experience. At face value, I mean, we don't want to be ageist in this matter. We have a real respect for also what our elders can bring into the situation. So a question to you both, like, how can we be able to talk about age as an asset in one matter? And how can candidates that are more established be able to really speak to that?
I mean, so I ran the independent expenditures for the Salem mayor's race, and that was the overwhelming issue, right?
Yeah.
And we put Katie Wilson's resume on mail pieces, and we moved him from 40 points in the primary to 49 points in the general. Just couldn't get the last point, but but the point is that the message has salience. Is it enough? In that race, it wasn't. But in other races, it may be.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an interesting example. I ran the independent expenditure for Katie Wilson. We moved her from winning to winning. Sorry. It's okay. Yeah.
And
She
is your,
won in the
and,
city
and
of
is your life
Seattle,
better
so
yet? So
I don't know. I don't need to put the seal of the mayor up in front of me, but no. But I think the point is, no, it's actually a really good point. I'm not just trying to be facetious about this, right? Like that was 100% the issue, right? Like putting up, is she experienced enough to be mayor? Up against on our side, right? The conversation of like this, what is the record that Bruce Harrell thinks is so great? And our mailers talked about, rent doubling and childcare getting more expensive and homelessness exploding and failed promises on shelter. And the reason I bring that up is just to go back to what I said at the start, which is the message of incumbents is actually, I feel for it, and I should say, because we didn't really introduce ourselves at the front of this, like, I'm not just a consultant for a couple of challengers against Democrats. I also work for a ton of incumbents as well that are facing challengers from more progressive candidates too. And so it is a real challenge to say, how do we talk about a record that I'm proud of, that was hard, particularly in the context of Olympia, which for us normies that don't lobby in Olympia, the kind of stuff that comes out of Olympia that people are so proud of, it feels so big to the Olympia lobbyists, but to the rest of us, we're like, that was the big deal. And two things can be true, right? It was both hard to accomplish in Olympia and also insufficient to tackle the problem.
Rivian can now sell cars directly. Oh my God,
Yeah, I mean, exactly, right. And so there's in my past, I advocated for policy change in Olympia. It took me 2 years to get a hotline for bias incidents and hate crimes passed in Olympia. I was so proud of it, right? But that's the kind of thing that it's like, a historic change got done and then also was largely meaningless to the impact in people's lives and something we're going to keep having to fight on and improve. And so the point I'm trying to make is that there is a real challenge for incumbents to figure out, how do I take credit for my record, but also not give off the idea that I'm satisfied with it. Like I am just as passionate about going to the mat to make your life better as I was when I ran the first time. And the incumbents that do that well will win, and those that don't will lose. And challengers are necessarily asking, is the progress you've gotten from these folks good enough yet? And good enough for you? Do you feel the impact in your life? That is, I think, the central question Katie asked, and it is part of why I think she won. Is that an answer?
Yeah, I believe so. And now is the part, the one of, I'm sure, many times tonight where I remind you all, I got pulled into this 2 hours ago. So I apologize for not taking time to let our panelists introduce themselves.
Oh, sorry.
It's my first time here. Okay, I'll try and curtail those excuses. But I do want to give each of our panelists just a moment to introduce yourselves a little bit more. You already got to know a little bit about them and some of at least what they were up to last year in the independent expenditure world. But maybe if you, Dean, would you like to go first?
Sure. Dean Nielsen. I worked in politics in Washington State and around the country and the world since 1992. I started when I was 1.5. Just kidding. So no, I've seen a lot, been on both sides of most of these fights, and love doing this type of work. So our company CN4 Partners, we are based here in Seattle, and we have offices in Cleveland, New York, DC, and Houston. So.
My name is Stephen Paolini. I'm a principal at Bottled Lightning Collective. We're a small boutique political consulting firm that is based here, actually in Tacoma, Washington, but I live here in Seattle, and we do work all around the country, including for most of the Democratic congressional delegation here in Washington, as well as several of the challengers running against Democrats too. And as I kind of alluded to, we did the PACs for Katie Wilson and Dion and Alexis.
Club.
Thank you.
I just bring that up. Actually, I'll turn it into a minor soliloquy, which is to say, I think I sort of have the impression of being primarily working with progressive candidates, but there's a broader piece to that too for me, and I work for a lot of folks who both benefit and are challenged by this trend.
Yeah, I mean, even though I have the tie and cufflinks and Rolex on tonight, our firm is working for Francisca Hong in Wisconsin, who may become the first socialist nominee for a major party for governor of that state. So, if you have enough clients, you are on both
the
sides
job,
of
yeah.
many of these issues. And, some of this type of work is like being a lawyer, right? And you go to battle for your client.
Going where the money is.
Yeah, we're all just blood-sucking vampires. Yeah, totally.
It is a business. I do have a payroll.
We all got to pay our bills. I'm going to take us to our next question for tonight, which is how do these primary challenges fit into the national narrative around the Democratic Party? Now, we started answering that question, but I have more. That narrative is that the Democratic establishment has lost credibility with their voters, who blame them for losing to Trump and who want them to be more aggressive in fighting the Trump administration and see the establishment as too beholden to big donors and powerful oligarchs. And there's certainly plenty of evidence to support that narrative nationally. Now, are there clear signs here locally that Democratic voters are dissatisfied with their elected leaders in the same way?
I guess we'll find out in a couple weeks. No, but New York Times did an incredible deep dive on this a couple weeks ago in their polling segment. And if you haven't had a chance to read it, I encourage you to look it up. But it was fascinating. And they asked Democrats that very same question. And it was very interesting because a lot of this is framed around, progressives versus moderates or socialists or whatever. And what they found in their polling is that about half of Democrats wanted the party to move to the left, about half of them wanted to move to the center to appeal to moderates to win a majority. But, all of them wanted Democrats to be fighters, and they just thought that the party was lame, and they're not wrong. There is no leadership, and so I think a lot of, in my mind, is around that context of, of finding a voice and using it.
Yeah, I think that's real. And the piece I'd add to that is I got a poll back for one of the candidates I'm working for that actually we asked this question of what do you most blame for your worsening economic condition? I mean, it was phrased a little bit more objective than that, but that was the essential thrust of the question. And we asked about things like, is it Donald Trump's tariffs? Is it mega corporations price gouging? Is it policies coming out of Olympia? And the majority of people actually said, and this was a little bit of more of a moderate district actually, but a majority of them said policies coming out of Olympia. And so I just bring that point up to say, right or wrong, like I'm a progressive, I happen to agree with most of the policies coming out of Olympia, but I do think there's actually plenty of evidence to suggest that there's a growing frustration with when we talk, I kind of touched on this earlier, when we talk about something as being like a big historic victory, we delivered historic investments in affordable housing. I think there are a lot of people like me that are like, okay, great, where could I have some of that, please? Like literally my rent from 2016 to 2026 doubled. And that is a lived experience that I have that's hard to argue with if your message is simply like, no, mission accomplished. Like, I did the thing. Don't worry. Like, I don't know why you're not feeling it, but like, I did make the investments that would make your life better. And so I think there is this tension around acknowledging that hard things happened in Olympia that were unthinkable even 2 or 3 or 4 years ago, but they have yet to make the kind of impact in people's lives that you'll see impact voters' behavior. The other piece of this, too, is I do think there's this, I mentioned this earlier as well, but I just want to reiterate it. Like, I think there's this growing feeling among the Democratic Party base that's asking the question, what does our party serve? Does it serve us, or does it serve a shockingly small set of powerful political stakeholders? And I want to broaden that from it's not just corporations. I think it's wealthy individuals, it's corporations. And I'm not blaming them. I don't think they're evil. I don't think corporations are evil. But I think people's perception that they are who these decisions are made to benefit is a growing dissatisfaction. And that's where you see a lot in polling and also in election results. Not taking money from corporate PACs as a talking point, when it's true, is like by and away the most persuasive characterization of a candidate for independents, lean Republicans, and flaming socialists, right? And so like I think there's a hesitation or a feeling from incumbents or a feeling from the establishment of saying like, oh, that's just a talking point that like DSA wants you to buy into. no. You're Trump splitting voter, right? Like the guy who voted for Donald Trump and also for Marie Perez, which is a confounding concept to me. But like their through line, for better or worse, was actually not taking money from corporate PACs, which is insane to me, but also like the truth. And so I think there's this real rejection, and across the board in a lot of these races, that's been one of the big through lines.
Trump did an excellent job of positioning himself as, kind of for the little guy and, and against big corporations and, in a way that many of us find really confounding, but he did it. And, and he also did it, against foreign wars and a variety of other things, most of which he's completely gone against, particularly in the second term. But, but he managed to sell that and it was real. And you're absolutely right. I mean, I think that, particularly in the age of AI, I think that, people are seeing themselves and their careers and their jobs and everything that they've worked for being flushed away. And they're floating along these rivers like, flotsam and jetsam and these rivers of economic uncertainty. And why am I here, right? And I think even this is true of the tax increases that Democrats passed in Olympia, $9 billion last year, the millionaires tax, capital gains tax, whatnot. It's like, well, what did I get? And that's what incumbents are going to have to message and figure out how to sell what they did. Because is it impacting your rent? Is it impacting childcare? No. I mean, realistically, let's be honest.
Yeah. One other, no, I'll save that actually. Sorry.
I wanted to
Turn it over to the middle.
You guys don't want to hear me yap that long. So.
Well, I want to build on this point because both of you mentioned the concept of a fighter and someone who's going to fight for them, which begs the question, what does it look like when a incumbent or a challenger is expressing, I'm going to fight for you? What does that tactically look like? And when have you seen candidates express that well and kind of in what ways?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is one of the big contrasts that comes out of the who you're choosing to take money from piece. It's not just a talking point, right? Like choosing not to, if you're going up against a lot of power and money and institution and endorsements, and you're actively choosing not to take money from people that might willingly give it to you, that is like an active choice. And certainly as a bloodthirsty consultant, my recommendation is typically take every dollar you can get. Right, and yet I think there is one of the ways people demonstrate well that they're going to fight for you is by saying, I'm actively not going to take money from these special interests, these PACs, these corporations. And that polls, by the way, extremely well. And we've seen it across the country. Candidates that take that position are winning everywhere. The other piece that I think is fascinating to me personally as we look at Washington State's political dynamics specifically is that there's this kind of growing progressive infrastructure that is putting real money and power and boots on the ground in a way that, at least for the time that I've been working in politics, I haven't quite seen before. I'm seeing Working Families Party and Transit Riders Union and Tech for Housing and Tech for Taxes and groups I actually hadn't even heard of before this election cycle, who I love, like Progressive Victory, show up and launch canvases with 20 or 30 or 40 people and go out and hit doors and be really good at it. Like they have trained, they have practiced, they have talked about it. I'm used to sort of like the folks on my progressive side being like, yeah, totally, I will join you in a tweet storm about this issue all day. And then like I talk to them about knocking on doors and they're like, okay, that's not for me, right? And so I'm seeing this growth of like really putting our money where our mouth is. A little self-interested here, but I think a part of that is some of the PACs that we've talked about in Seattle, where we've made the decision to say, like, we don't want to just rely on when a handful of powerful unions that we love are ready to make a decision to support a candidate. Like, we want to go out and raise money for ourselves. And even sometimes when they're not that interested in a candidate, like Katie Wilson had 2 unions that endorsed her, right? But we still managed to raise $500,000, not quite your almost $2 million, but $500,000 to communicate on her behalf. But that was a lot of like progressive donors and activists and organizations that typically might have been like tweeting on Blue Sky or whatever. Is it still tweeting? But they were like, no, I'm going to put $10,000 where my mouth is. That's something that's new, I feel like. where they're responding to fighters and they're saying, like, I get that this game requires real money and power behind it, and I'm not just going to let the other side do it. Like, we're going to play our part too. That was super interesting to me.
I mean, no question. I mean, there's a lot of energy on the left. I mean, and I think the rise of the Democratic Socialist, which, a decade ago was kind of isolated to Bernie Sanders, right? But now this is a real thing. And in the 43rd district, it's probably a third of the voters, because this is billed as a 43rd district debate, right? So we should probably touch on that. But, it is a real segment of the primary electorate. I mean, they've more or less taken over the Democratic Party in most of the Seattle LDs, and I think progress and evolution are a good thing, frankly, and I personally would like to see a European multi-party system, but as the political science student I once was, but we are in a two-party system, and we're fighting over what the heart and soul of the Democratic Party is, and I think that's a debate worth having. But I also think that this is happening because it's not just in this race. It's in the 46th and Jared Paulette. It's in the 32nd with Lauren Davis. It's in the 23rd with Tara Simmons. It's this is happening kind of all over the place. It's the Amy Wallen race. It's in a variety of places, and I think this is one reason this is happening is that Democrats have had a very healthy majority in Olympia, for decades in the state house since 16, 17-ish in the state Senate, and there's basically a lack of a functional Republican Party. If this was an era where we were like, oh, we need this one seat, like don't this type of thing, like we're just gonna hike it up and support this person. I mean, 10 years ago there was Democrats in the state legislature that were anti-choice, that were anti-gay, that were anti every tax, that were anti virtually everything that most people in this room probably believe in. And all of those people are gone. I mean, and it's funny because it's like some of the people that are now labeled as being, oh, they're so conservative as a Democrat. It's like 10 years ago they would have been a flaming liberal, but the center has changed and the center has shifted, and that's not a bad thing. But we have to recognize it is what it is. There's no functional Republican Party in the state, and so the tension is becoming versus what kind of Democrat are you? Are you a moderate establishment Democrat, or are you a progressive fighter Democrat? And that coalition shifts around a variety of issues, around taxation, around public safety, are probably the two biggest areas I see in the party right now. But sometimes other things.
Yeah, one little tiny point I want to make, and then obviously we'll get to these issues more later too. But one of the surprising facts actually is like the Democratic Socialists in Washington State and Seattle have actually not endorsed any of the challengers running against incumbents this year. And so I think the idea that that's a big part of this here locally is just not true. Not the organization, but the people. Maybe. I mean, but my point is that it's a real contrast between what you saw in New York, where Brad Landers and Claire Valdez and that whole Mamdani slate was a full DSA Mamdani slate of candidates with a very specific prescription around DSA, and that is just like not the dynamic here yet. Who knows if that'll change? I'm not as up on the idiosyncrasies of like New York DSA versus Seattle DSA versus, I will say I do a lot of work in Oregon as well. DSA is a much bigger part of those intra-party challenges, but I will also add there's much fewer intra-party challenges in Oregon this year. One of the reasons why I think is that the party there has done a much better job of planting a flag on the places where they're going to go out and challenge Republicans. It was my first time, and I found it so different than what I'm used to in Washington State. But I went to the Democratic Party of Oregon's conference this year because we were doing a ton of work for their caucus, and it was a total rah-rah. Like I felt like I was in a cult in a good way, where they were really gassing us up about like, we're going to go we're going to take a bite out of the Senate majority leaders or the Senate minority leaders district. We're probably going to lose by 10 points, but we want to get it to 5. Like it was like nasty and personal in a way that I dug. Like it was like we are going to go and make it close in a district we have no business making it close in, and we're going to raise a lot of money to do it. And
That's
I was
awesome.
super into it, right? And I actually think that like a lot of the people like me who might have been more on the like DSA, progressive, leftist background were like, hell yeah, like let's go, right? And part of it is too, they were like, and when we get this supermajority, we're gonna enshrine reproductive rights, we're gonna tax the rich, we're gonna like do all of these awesome things. And so I guess it goes back to your actual question, which was like, is there any evidence, this is a question a while ago, whatever, but like, is there any evidence that people are dissatisfied with what we're approaching this year? I think there's a bit of tension. Like, I feel tension. I'm not dissing any of the historic achievements that came out of Olympia when I say like, man, I feel it's a bit of like it's an intense marshmallow test. It's like, you need to care a lot about this thing that maybe possibly potentially will make an impact in your life some many years down the road. And that's a harder sell than I think I'm getting in the places I do work like Oregon or New Hampshire, where the battle lines are just a little bit clearer. And I think a lot of these challenges, one of the things I love about them is like, man, they would be the first person on the bus from Seattle to Yakima to go knock doors in the 14th LD. If that was like meaningfully on the table, and we've just sort of like given up. Maybe that's not fair and you can correct me, but I feel like genuinely like we've just given up on districts that Harris won.
I feel like that.
Is that fair? Am I
I feel
crazy?
that the interest groups have decided, fairly or unfairly, we have enough Democrats.
Yeah, I think you're right. And that's
Yeah.
actually the point I'm making is like, I don't know if people know this, like there are enough districts in Washington state that Harris won in 2024 that if we won those at the local level, we would have a supermajority.
I mean, I
Like,
have
what are we doing here, guys? Like,
I
what's-
have a candidate. I have a candidate in the 18th legislative district in Clark
Yeah,
County.
well, let me know when the next door knocking is, yeah.
Randy Knott, right? And she is getting pummeled by the RIEs because they're afraid that she's going to win, and there's no help from the Democrats.
Yeah.
And she has not even been able to amass enough money from the Democratic interest groups to send a single piece of mail, not one. And I'm
like,
keep
that
calling
is
people,
crazy.
keep calling the unions, keep calling all this, and so the Republicans are so freaked out that this woman is going to win that they've now sent out 3 pieces of mail, and the interest groups are kind of like, well, we have enough Democrats to pass whatever we need, so whatever,
Yeah, and Harris won that district just
Absolutely.
by 4 points almost.
We won the state senate seat.
We won the state senate seat,
Yeah.
and Marie Perez won that district by almost 6 points.
Yeah.
So like this is a district we could clean house in if we wanted to. I'm on your side on this one.
No,
Tell
I
me
know,
when the
I know.
IE is.
No, it's okay. Call Kurt.
Yeah, there you go. Fuck me, man.
On that note, though, let's talk about some of our local challengers. But before doing that, I jotted this down. A cult in a good way means it's a good cult.
Yeah.
Like it's working.
Yeah.
That is, so whatever they're doing in Oregon, I'm scared. Or we could take a few notes. So, but taking us to, like, let's talk about some of the challengers and that's going on right now, because some insurgents really are leaning on grassroots and labor networks, but others are leaning onto tech, public safety, or technocratic solutions, so fundraising and endorsements between all of those may vary. Now, are these democratic challengers in Washington a part of a coherent movement, or rather are they a patchwork of local insurgencies? And from that point, what do they share, and how do they differ?
Yeah, I mean, I'll jump in. Like, I don't think, in contrast to a place like New York, I don't think they're a slate, right? There was a much clearer, this is a slate of people that are challenging incumbents. We're going to support all of them, knock doors for all of them, raise money for all of them in New York, that I just don't think is materialized here in Seattle at all. The mayor has endorsed a couple of folks, but it's not across the board, and it's not nearly as cohesive. What is interesting to me, though, on the flip side of that, is the set of organizations that have been willing to buy into those challenges. It's groups like the Urbanist, Working Families Party, AFT Washington was a surprise to me that endorsed multiple challengers against incumbents as a union. Tech for Housing, Tech for Taxes, Progressive Victory. I could go on and bore you with like acronyms. But there is a shared infrastructure that is willing to jump in and support challenges. just as interesting to me, although on the other side, is pretty much uniformly, like, larger unions have been pretty much disinterested in any challenge, regardless of the idiosyncrasies of the race, who has more experience, what their voting record is. Like, by and large, large unions have pretty much passed on every challenge, for the one exception, I believe, of Amy Whalen versus Jessica Forsyth, where the contrast is so clear because of the millionaire's tax vote, which I think gets to some other like fundamental issues. But pretty much everywhere else, Tara Simmons versus Daria England, Ron and Will versus Jerry, Caleb versus Sharon Tamika Sanders. I won't name all of them, but like pretty much across the board, unions have chosen to back the incumbents. And
Lauren
the same,
Davis,
yeah,
like
Lauren
the whole-
Davis versus Imran, right? The same set of progressive groups have actually backed pretty much all of the challengers, and that speaks to this like bubbling and growing infrastructure that I think is really fascinating. The one other piece I want to add to that, without rambling too long, is that I think the Democratic Party as a vehicle for grassroots activism is pretty much dead.
Yeah.
Like, there is no meaningful door-knocking grassroots campaign coming from the state Democratic Party or really the caucuses of any kind. For better or worse, we could debate that. Instead, what we're seeing are these progressive organizations like Working Families Party that are stepping into that vacuum. Common Power is another group that I think is super interesting. They helped a ton with Katie Wilson's race, and they really put their money where their mouth is. Like, those guys knocked like 30,000 doors, right? Which is a lot of doors in a local race like this. And that's actually like really interesting, and it speaks
it's
to
20
this.
doors an hour. Do the math, guys. It's
Yeah.
like that's a lot of people.
It's not
power.
just blue sky warriors, right? Like that's real boots on the ground.
I mean, and I think that's very true, and I think that you can, if you think about the 1960 style organizing structure, right? You had the Democratic Party was the only multi-issue, kind of committee that worked on campaigns, and then you had a variety of single issue, committees like the choice groups, the environmental
Sierra Club,
groups,
right, yeah.
whatever, labor, et cetera, that were single issue, but that did multiple functions, right? And so now that there's all of these other, in the new organizing model, kind of post 2000 in a lot of ways, you're seeing multi-issue committees that have multiple functions that are not the Democratic Party and that are more appealing to people, frankly, like some of the groups that you mentioned.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the question is, though,
Sorry.
are they a part of a patchwork, or is it a coherent strategy?
I'm like struggling with that question because ultimately I think if you force me into one of them, which is totally your job, I think I would ultimately say it's a patchwork of candidates. I don't necessarily see like a slate.
I think it can become one, but it is not always one. I think there's a race-specific, candidate-specific things.
Yeah, I've seen like a couple of times. I guess the one example I might give was like Hannah and Caleb and Sharon Tamiko Santos in that seat. They've kind of like gravitated a little bit more towards each other as a little bit of a slate. I don't quite see that with like Hannah and Will or Hannah and Ron in the 46th, which is not like a shot at any particular race. I just don't. I guess I'm confidently saying like I don't really see them as running as a slate really at all. I don't think they're approaching it that way.
But you also have these Democratic incumbents that some of whom may have strayed on one issue, right? Whereas like the Hackney race is about public safety, right? But he was fine on the millionaire's tax, right? For progressive. So it depends on the dynamics of the individual race to a certain extent.
Yeah. Is that an answer? Sorry, I was trying.
I think you all are unpacking this really well in a very interesting way. And it does bring us to this matter of, our primary battles nationally have produced some energizing upsets and also costly intra-party wounds. Washington's deep blue status changes, but doesn't eliminate general election risk or legislative costs. So, could repeated intra-party fights in Washington weaken Democratic electoral prospects or legislative effectiveness, or could they strengthen accountability and policy innovation?
Yes.
No.
All of
No.
the above.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I think yes on both of your questions. I mean, look, I think that challengers to incumbents are a good thing, as you know, from a little d democracy point of view, right? I mean, obviously, if I'm working for somebody, I'm like, oh, I don't want anybody to challenge you because I want to win the race. I mean, my job is to win, right? And the easiest way to win is to not have a candidate against you. But you know, from the little d democracy standpoint, are there a lot of incumbents across America that are not challenged that should be? Absolutely. And this is on both parties. This is on both progressives, and moderates and everything. You know. Should people be held accountable for their votes, and should voters get a real choice? Absolutely. Should they get it every election? Absolutely. Do they? No, almost never. I mean, I live in the 46. Jerry Paulette is my representative. This is the first time I've ever had a chance to weigh in on somebody against him, ever. He was appointed to the seat. Nobody meaningful ever challenged him. And, you know, and you may love him, you may hate him, but you didn't really get an opportunity to replace him either way. I mean, yeah, there's been challengers, but they've been lame, you know? So I think from a little d democracy point of view, challengers are an excellent thing. Now, can they cost you a seat? Sure. I mean, would you have Marie Guscamp Perez if the incumbent hadn't lost her congressional race? Debatable answer, probably not. So, you know, and these things happen on both sides of the aisle. You know, if the wrong person, quote unquote, comes out of the primary, does it change the dynamics of the race? Absolutely. Now, do I see Republicans somehow having a surge in Washington and taking back the House or Senate? No. I mean, again, lack of a functional Republican Party in Washington was one of the points I made earlier. They're probably the lamest I've ever seen them.
Yeah, I think I want to take this in a slightly different direction, which is to say, this idea that because Ron or Will is challenging Jerry Paulette, or Caleb is challenging Sharon Tomiko Santos, or Hannah is challenging Jamie Peterson, the idea that those challenges are the reason that your candidate in the 18th LD or Dimas in the 14th LD or in the 17th LD are not getting the kind of resources that they should if we were serious as a party about growing our majorities. That idea, like that decision, you said it earlier, was a decision made about not feeling that growing our majority is all that important.
Right.
We have the votes we need to get what we want.
Yeah.
I'm not blaming the folks that make those decisions. It's your money, it's your time, it's your energy. Put it where you want. My only problem with it is the only person that's responsible for that decision is the person who made it.
Yeah.
Don't put that on us. Like, you made a call about your politics, great. Own it. And the reason I get so worked up about that piece of it is I think that accusation is fundamentally an admission that our party is fragile, that it is so weak that a challenge to an incumbent of 20 plus years grinds the whole damn thing to a halt. And what I think a lot of challengers, or maybe this is just me and I'm putting it on my challengers, are pushing for is like, can we reach for something a little bit beyond the horizon that says it's possible to have a Democratic Party that is truly multicultural, multi-generational, diverse in ideology and economic background that could sustain more than just one thing at a time. That would be, I guess what I'm trying to say ultimately is like, I think we are so reliant on the donations and the energy of one or two major political stakeholders, whether they be massive corporations or individuals or special interests or labor unions, that without their interest, we can't do anything. And I don't blame them. Like, I think all of us in this room have taken too many shortcuts. Like, we have relied on their power and we have pretended or deluded ourselves into thinking that their power is our power. But it's borrowed power. And if you want power, you have to take it yourself. And for me, that's like the fundamental charge here of like, can we dream of a party that could sustain a big tent? Like, I don't mean that as a cliche. Like, I believe in a Democratic Party, as hot takey as this might feel to many of my friends on the progressive side as well. Like, I believe in a Democratic Party that can sustain Marie Perez and Hannah. Like, that is my party. I don't find that to be hypocritical at all. And I would challenge us to reach to not just 50+1, but 60% of the vote. And to like consign these MAGA people to history by beating them so thoroughly. That's what I want. And I want to be with you, Dean, on winning in the 18th LD. Like, there's nothing I want to do more than run a program and the 18th LD, and I can't, and I find that to be outrageous and absurd and unserious as a party, that we're not planting a flag and saying, Harris won this district by almost 4 points. We should clean house. Like, what are we talking about? That we're giving that a pass and that your candidate can't even send a mailer? Are you kidding me? That's crazy.
So
Sorry, guys.
anybody wants to donate, randyknott.com. But no, I mean, seriously, I mean, you know,
That's absurd.
I think we're in total agreement here. I mean, and I tell my candidates all the time, you have to chart your own course. You have to, create your own destiny. And I also agree with you that we in a two-party system, which we are, for better or for worse, that we should be able to sustain both visions, and a bird needs two wings to fly, and I'm fully supportive of that. And it just has to be the right wing in the right place. There's lots of very prominent Washington politicians that started by beating incumbents. And Bob Ferguson, Gary Locke, Greg Nichols all beat incumbents in their first race. Fun fact, and so it's not these are people that beat incumbents of their own party. And so this isn't necessarily a new thing. I think what the new thing is this year is how many there are. And it's an unprecedented number that are so well funded, they're running serious campaigns, whether or not the interest groups are part of it. Like this Will Dreyer guy comes out of nowhere and raises $280,000 in 5 minutes. I mean, Ron Davis, who has been a fixture of South politics, raises 150 or so. I mean,
these are real.
These are real challengers. This isn't some guy that puts his name on the ballot that raises 10 grand. These are real people that are running real campaigns, and it's impressive.
Yeah, it's no good space guy, that's for sure.
One other piece I want to add, at risk of I know you have more questions, but one other piece I add is I believe fundamentally this is going to keep happening. This isn't going away. Mm-hmm. We're not going to stop seeing Democratic on Democratic challengers unless the Republican Party wakes up tomorrow and decides it's going to be serious and start competing in Washington State, which I don't believe will happen. No. And so part of why I bring that up is we've got to figure out how to be able to have good fights, righteous fights where we disagree, and I go to the mat with you, which we're on the opposite side of a fight. You're working for Jamie, I'm working for Hannah. Cool. Yeah. Let's go to the mat. And then tomorrow, I want to wake up, win or lose, and I want to help you in the 18th. Yeah. And that is what we have to be about. And I am begging. This is my mantra in the morning when I wake up. I am begging people to chill out and just see the bigger picture. We will fight today. Yeah. I am counting on you tomorrow. That's not a future thing several years down the road. That's literally tomorrow. And we have to find a way to just be humans with each other and hold that tension and fight really viscerally and still love each other afterwards. And if you want to look at we beat Ron, or we beat Hannah, or we beat Caleb, or we beat Jessica Forsythe, and that's it, you are missing the forest for the trees, man. They are tapping into something real, and you have to recognize that and appreciate that. Or I guess we can just lose our democracy, which is actually how I feel about this. I think the downside of not figuring out how to do this well, practicing fighting with one another well, is that we just don't have a democracy afterwards.
Right. For any that you have kids, it's like having siblings, right? They're not always on the same page, and we can practice politics in a way where we can disagree and not being disagreeable. And I think that's what we should all aim towards, right? And I think I think many of us that are practitioners have accomplished that, not all, but I think many of us have accomplished that. And I think the electorate needs to be able to have these conversations. I mean, like Tim Burgess and Shama Sawant were elected on the same ballot by the same voters, and they're running citywide, right? I mean, that means there are people that voted for both, and those are two very competing visions, and that's okay, and we can have those conversations, and because I was one of them, I was a Sawant and Burgess voter, and you can have those tensions, and I think those tensions are healthy and they're good, and these are good things in democracy, But now her behavior after she got elected, I'm going to have some disagreement with, but
Remorseful.
I mean, the nice thing about elections is you can fix them afterwards.
Gosh, well, this is an exciting night for me. I've never met a Sawant and Burgess voter. So. Wow. So we've talked about New York a little bit. Now I actually have a question about New York. Who wrote this question? Is Seattle, New York? Obviously not. But to draw on that, thank you. And we should be proud of who we are.
We have better transit. Oh, sorry.
But drawing on that, Katie Wilson.
Better pizza.
We do have better pizza. Katie Wilson just endorsed Hannah Sabio-Hal and Ron Davis right after Mamdani scored huge political wins with his slate when the insurgent congressional candidates he backed went 3 for 3, knocking off Democratic incumbents in the New York City primaries. So how do you see Wilson's decision to intervene in these races, and how important are the outcomes of these races for her political future?
Yeah, I can jump in. I should disclose too. Like, I worked on her IE. I have actually never met Katie Wilson, so I have zero insight into her psychology at all. But I'm gonna pretend I do. Which is to say, I think part of how she got elected is without any real major special interests making her campaign happen, and because she got elected without them, I think rightly she doesn't owe them anything. And so to me, this isn't that surprising. I understand the comparison to New York. You'd have to ask her if that was like the main leading factor. Certainly like post hoc ergo propter hoc, like it happened after, so therefore it was because of it. But ultimately what I think this is about is she sees in those two candidates a similarity to her of people who are running righteous, progressive challenges to incumbents, do not have the support of any of the kind of main institutional progressive establishment forces that also didn't support her. And I think there's a little bit of like, I see in you a little bit of myself and I want to support that person, and love her or hate her, like that's her psychology. I think there's like a really positive thing to that, which is like, real tough change does require a little bit of tension with the status quo. Like if it were easy to get big stuff done, it would have happened already, and you're necessarily going to ruffle some feathers with establishment players whenever you try to do something meaningful. And so I think we could use a little bit more of like a, you guys didn't help me, so I don't owe you anything mentality. Next time, maybe you'll help her. But
I'll be more crass. I think she was getting too much from her base for not weighing in, and I think she was responding to the people that got her there, which is fair. I mean, we all have our constituencies, and I think she was responding to hers. I'll also say that when if you have the big brass ones to go up against the Senate Majority Leader, you better win. And so we'll see, because he's going to win that race.
Now, as a follow-up to both of you, I mean, what does it mean specifically for Mayor Wilson's political future based on the outcome of some of these races? How much do you think those are tied?
I think she'll be judged on what she does for the city. And frankly, I'm rooting for her. I live in Seattle. I have a house in Seattle. My kids are in school in Seattle. I want her to do well. I want every mayor of Seattle to do well, whether or not I think that they should be there or not. And I'm rooting for her. And, for the next 3 years, I'm going to do what I can to support her. And then I'll judge her then. If she does a fantastic job, I'll be like, well, I'm not going to take on a challenger against you because you made Seattle a better place. And ultimately, if she does that, and I hope she does, then she should be reelected with 100% of the vote.
Yeah, I think I agree with that to a certain extent. I mean, part of the subtext here is like an implicit threat that if you make an endorsement in these races and then you lose, that whether it's the Senate Majority Leader or Jerry Paulette or anyone else, that they're going to punish you for that decision. I think in every accusation like that, there's also a confession of a kind of politics that's very transactional and very personal, and for me, very dark and unfortunate. I don't think you, as a Senate Majority Leader or as a state representative or as a state senator of any kind, leave Peterson out of it in particular. I think punishing your political opponents is just bad, for me, bad politics, bad democracy. You are elected by the people of Seattle to make Seattle a better place. If you're feuding with the mayor of Seattle because you didn't like how she endorsed, that is a transactional, personal, negative politics that I just don't agree with. It may be true. It probably is
but
true.
Isn't that true on the reverse, though? I mean,
Maybe. Is she punishing?
I mean, this goes both ways here.
But I don't know. Is the mayor? No. But let me give you an example then. I mean, if you want to go there, Mayor Wilson was actively pushing for a policy championed by the Master Builders Association that donated hundreds of thousands of dollars to oppose her. And yet she was still doing that because she thought it was right. Now, it caught flack with her base, and it might be dead. But my point is, clearly not a transactional politician. Otherwise, she would have said, oh, guys that just spent hundreds of thousands of dollars against me, click, leave me alone, right? So I think I'm just going to push back on that talking point because I think there is a better politics we can aspire to. And if you're admitting to the idea that I will actively punish the city of Seattle for the mayor's decision to endorse against me, that is a confession. I don't think that's what Peterson's saying, by the way. I think he's better than that. I hope he's better than that. But I would find that to be an objectionable style of politics.
How do you punish your own electorate? That makes no sense. But that being said, to take personalities out of politics is impossible. I mean, how do you take people out of politics?
But I just went on a whole tirade about how we need to fight hard and go to the mat together and then wake up in the morning and say, I will knock doors with you in the 18th LD or in the 17th LD or the 14th LD. The difference is I mean that. I genuinely mean that. And I will have zero doubt in my mind if Peterson is reelected that I will go, not that he would ever ask me, and help him with whatever progressive policy he's pushing. To me, it's a righteous, important fight that we do because that's democracy, baby. It's all good. And I'm begging, as a person with no power, that we aspire to that.
Incredible. So, no apologies needed. That was beautiful. Moving us along, though, so we know that we've talked a little bit about this matter, but persistent primaries can prompt sitting lawmakers to move left, signal more boldly, or double down on pragmatism to keep coalitions together and pass legislation. And Washington's near supermajority raises the stakes for internal caucus strategy. Now, if challengers keep gaining traction, how do you think that will change the behavior of sitting Democratic legislators in Olympia during next session?
Me first? Okay. I would say, I think it could be a real sea change in attitude. And this is also kind of how I felt a little bit about Katie in general. And now, I will admit, the jury's still out on the success of that, right? It's been a somewhat rocky first 6 months. But the politics that Mayor Harrell presented, I'm not even really blaming him for, but it's based in this idea of if you satisfy the political stakeholders, you've done enough to win re-election. I've always not quite believed that, and I think what Katie was calling on is like, doesn't matter if you've answered the phone call at midnight and done what these individual interest groups want you to do, you actually have to deliver something meaningful that voters want you to do. I think that's pretty much the same basis as the challengers in general, because it kind of calls the question on this whole house of cards, this whole kind of fragile ecosystem that says, as long as you ultimately answer the phone call and vote the right way when the whip cracks, you will be protected. If that's no longer true, it does change behavior. I think of course it does, and it changes people's calculus. We can all disagree. I would say probably for the better. Like if you feel fundamentally accountable more towards outcomes and less towards whether you've satisfied interest groups, I think that is a better way for democracy to work. And that is the question I think that the challengers represent. And it's so hard. I mean, look, I really get it. Like I think politics is the art of holding tension between what is and what could be. And part of what we're feeling right now is like we want to hold on to this status quo because we're so fearful of what could come after it. And my point is, my belief is like the harder you hold, the tighter you grip, the more blood drains from your fingers and the more it might just slip, right? And ultimately, I think there's just a better balance of ambition and feeling like we've done enough. And so I do really believe that like some of these challengers, not all of them even need to win, but a few of them, and frankly, maybe we've already actually seen the impact of this. Like I would argue that some of these legislators in the legislative session already reacted to the concept, to the potential of getting a challenger. Hot take, would Jamie Peterson ultimately have voted against the estate tax if he wasn't fearful of getting a challenger? You tell me. I don't know. I'm not actually asking you. The point is...
how would I know?
You might know. I'm not really trying to go there. My point is just to say, I think people are already reacting to this reality of like, oh, I need to like step up my game. Something I heard in the Seattle Times article, for example, is like, I'm reacquainting myself with the district. Like, hell yeah, dude. Like, you got to go knock on doors. That's great. Whether you win or lose. Like, a lot of my friends support Peterson. Not jabbing at that at all. But like, I think it's awesome that you've got to go run a real campaign. My friend Dean gets to make money. Everyone wins, right? Like, no one loses.
Consultants for president. No, I mean, there's a lot of things that you said that I agree with. I mean, the satisfying interest groups thing. I mean, that's why Greg Nichols lost, a generation ago, right? I mean, these are dynamics that have presented itself before. It's if you think about these politics, I mean, I think that there's a lot of these races that are moderates versus Democrats. I mean, clearly that dynamic's playing out in 43rd and in the Amy Wallen race. But there are other races where there's other things the dynamics at play, like the Tara Simmons, which is about her personal behavior. And, and I think that these are fair conversations to have. I mean, she has an amazing personal story about how she overcame her personal situation and then got to the legislature and kind of bad on her personal side of the equation, not in the legislative side, but the personal side. And, and then you have Melanie Morgan down in Pierce County, where she has a 98% voting record with Labor, and they didn't endorse her. And so it's like, you have these other situations that aren't neatly described as progressive versus moderate that are also interesting. The David Hackney situation is interesting. Yeah. The Lauren Davis race is interesting. And so these are things that are not neatly carved up into left versus moderate, that dynamic that we love to put things into.
Yeah.
We've talked a little bit about endorsing organizations like, unions, like business and other funders. How do you see business, labor, and other funders deciding between incumbents and challengers in Washington State? And what do you think those choices indicate about the Democratic Party?
I think the business community is lost in a lot of ways because historically they would gravitate to the Republicans. A lot of them are Republicans personally, and they're trying to figure out a way to be relevant in this one-party state that they're now in. And I think we act like, oh, Washington State's been blue, and because we won the presidential race here since 1988, right? But in the legislative level, they have been relevant for a long time, and they've had the state senate off and on until about 8 years ago, right? And so they've had power, and they haven't really figured out a way to equate to this new normative reality, and where they'll fund Republican challengers against Democrats that vote with them more often than not. And so then that makes Democrats even less likely to be with them. So they're really kind of lost in a lot of ways. And and labor has their own challenges. It's like how they in the mayor's race. Is that Katie Wilson kind of came out of those types of movements, although not directly labor, did not get labor union endorsements right off the bat. So it's like, how do they acquaint, the politics are changing, but the interest groups are kind of, in a lot of ways, locked into like old school D versus R fights because that's how they're kind of oriented, and they need to change as well.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. I mean, and part of this too is like Washington's in this weird spot where a lot of the other places we're kind of talking about, like New York, has been solidly a trifecta state for I don't know how long, like decades at this point. Washington State, I mean, we had a Republican Senate majority in 2017, so it's not that long for us to go. I mean, it's kind of quite remarkable, like to go so dramatically from we are a split chamber Republican Democrat chamber to suddenly now we're like basically a supermajority, and the fights we had not so long ago, like somebody can reasonably have started their career thinking of themselves in the dynamic of I'm going to be battling Republicans to now at this point, like those guys have no power and we can ignore them entirely. That's actually kind of a jarring. I think a lot of the incumbents are caught in that actually, where they're like, dude, what do you want from me? Like I did all this cool stuff that would have never been possible when I first got elected. And then it's like, yeah, bro, but like you got elected when there were Republicans. We're way past that.
I mean, Amy Wallen's district, 28% Republican vote. Vancouver, Washington, 38% Republican vote.
Right.
I mean, it's just like, it's kind of crazy.
It's been a really dramatic shift, and I think a lot of people have felt like the ground moving under them, and I have some empathy to that of like, oh my God, I don't really know where to put my next foot. You brought up a really interesting point that we're not talking about today because it's really not. It is still D versus D. It's just not challenger versus incumbent. I am seeing the business community actually spending a lot of money in open seats for Democrats, whether it's in the 24th legislative district or the 42nd legislative district, where you are seeing the sort of moderate business community playing in a significant way for these open seats. And I kind of am a little surprised by, somebody smarter than me can tell me why, but like I don't really see a progressive a vehicle on the opposite side of that. Like I sort of expected that to be, whether it's New Direction or a different PAC or something like that would typically play that role. We're kind of not seeing that. What it reminds me of, sadly, is like 2023 in Seattle, where we had more moderate candidates running that had pretty significant spending from real estate, master builders, other sort of those set of business community interests. And labor, again, this sounds like criticism, but it's really just me stating reality, like took a pass on that year. I think there was maybe a total of like $10,000 of spending across all 7 district-wide races. They sort of took a pass on that, and then we saw progressives like really lose in a big way. I'm not trying to make Seattle the center of the universe and like apply that to everywhere, but it's not a contrast. I'm just building on your point about like whether the business community is lost in the forest. They might just be like playing the long game in a way that will work out really well for them, where they could run the table on a bunch of legislative races that no one's paying attention to because they don't happen to fall on the I-5 corridor. Because the progressive community, including the progressive establishment community, is so focused on, I don't know if I want to blame my challengers, but I think they're focused on like millionaires tax, defending against no hate in Washington.
Well, Supreme Court, too.
Supreme Court. Like there's a bunch of other stuff that we care about that I think we're just like leaving a lot of battles unfought. I don't have a crystal ball. Talk to me after the election. But I do worry as a progressive, like, that feels like a bad dynamic. But anyway, I mean, some of these people are people I work for, so.
Yeah.
Well, it is my job to make Seattle the center of the universe. And I say that also knowing that our local issues that we're facing here, from runaway housing costs, zoning reform, the millionaire's tax, policing, public safety debates, how we're responding to the crises that the federal administration has put us in, have animated a lot of our recent primary fights in Washington. So which Washington-specific or federal issues over the last few years are most responsible for provoking these intra-party challenges?
I think it's just a lame response of the National Democrats, right? Like, they just suck. You know? They're awful. I mean, has anybody been proud of anything that's come out of Chuck Schumer's mouth in the last 2 years? I haven't. Hakeem Jeffries, any of them. Like, you know, like, I mean, I've just gone home at night and been like,
Yeah.
what are these people doing? You know? Nothing. And you know, and I look, I mean, I know enough about the legislative process to know that they don't have a lot of levers, but try, you know? I just don't, I don't, they're not my heroes.
Yeah, I actually totally agree with what you're saying. I would probably add to that, like, a little generic affordability in general, but I'll specifically target housing and childcare. To me, feel like issues that I'm pretty depressed about as a political operative. Like, this is something I find really hard for incumbents to talk about. Like, you've delivered hundreds of millions of dollars for affordable housing, and yet my lived experience, maybe I'm just a whiny millennial, but like, my lived experience is my rent doubled in that time. And so it's just a hard sell to me to be like, we did it, mission accomplished, I did the thing. And I will, now, a little bit more seriously, I would argue like there's not been enough of the conversation focused on like what makes housing cheaper and faster to build. Like, I would actually argue there's a missing, like, we attacked this mainly from a subsidy policy lens and not enough from a like fundamental permitting reform, building reform, environmental review reform lens.
Yeah,
maybe that's too nerdy.
Like, no, but I mean,
like that's to me a big thing.
We have done a lot of this to ourselves. I mean, tried to get a building permit in the city of Seattle. I've done it twice. It sucks. You know, like it takes years. It's horrible.
Yeah.
You know, and you know, if you're building something that costs you money.
Right.
I mean, like all of these things, these progressive reforms that we've done, and they're all good things for the environment, for whatever cause that we champion them for. But at the end of the day, they end up adding to the cost, and just be real about it, acknowledge it, you know, and at the end of the day, some things we should add for the cost for, like we're giving people living wage. It's like, well, maybe restaurant prices are going to rise because we're actually paying people in the back of the house a living wage. That's a good thing, in my opinion. And maybe you need to go out one less time a week because of that. Deal with it, you know. But at least be honest about it.
So yeah, I think housing is a big part. The other one I would say is childcare, for very similar reasons. We've attacked childcare from like a subsidy lens of we're gonna expand, you know, working connections, the program that gives families, you know, subsidies for childcare programs. But fundamentally, we've also like made it a lot more expensive to open a childcare center in the state of Washington. And I don't want to get too policy wonky about it, but the point is, I think those two issues in particular there are real critiques that the status quo has done a bad job of addressing those issues. Maybe we've sacrificed in some respects. There's a tug and pull. On one end, there's the quality of the thing, right? High quality early learning for kids. On the other end, there's the affordability of the thing. Maybe we've just done a little bit too much towards the quality and not enough towards the affordability. Like, I'm not a candidate for office, but like, I just think there's a fundamental problem when you tell people, I'm passing a capital gains tax, it's $250,000 a year, and also, by the way, your childcare went from, I wrote a report for a candidate that was like a childcare plan, and I put in some numbers that I had pulled from 2021, and it said childcare in the city of Seattle costs $16,000 a year. And then the person I asked to look at it was like, hey bro, I can't file childcare for less than $50,000 a year in the city of Seattle. And I was like, well, right? So there's just a problem here, I think, with those issues, and that is fueling a lot of this problem.
I mean, what's the line? It's like you can have something cheap, fast, or good, and you get two of the three, and
Right.
you don't get all three.
Put that on a mailer. Well, building us on this point, we've talked a little bit about how challengers are facing barriers. They don't have institutional ties and connections to big organizations yet. They have lower name recognition, and that means often a steeper fundraising hurdle. Yet, we are seeing some of those challengers leverage online fundraising and lean into those activist networks to close the gaps. So practically speaking, what barriers from fundraising, endorsements, community recognition, organizational capacity are really constraining challengers in Washington, and how have you seen successful challengers overcome those barriers?
So real quick, I'm going to do something totally inappropriate, which is to say we have 10 minutes left for this conversation. That's a really great question. I think maybe we could ask the audience one quick question. Sorry, this is totally
You didn't
messed
put
up
that on my
with me.
paper. I didn't know we were doing
I'm so
audience
sorry.
questions.
We could ask the audience one question and then try to close.
Oh, I'd love
Is that okay?
All right.
I'm so sorry.
Okay, I'm going with the first hand that just went up.
So going back to the last thing you said, Steve, that Faustian bargain on the supply side, which requires that business continues to supply more of the cost to fund our social solutions. And labor is complicit in that because at the end of the day, it's county and city employees that are benefiting, not employees. How do you square that?
Yeah. You're putting me on the hot seat, man. That's rough.
That's what friends do.
I know. I love
I
it.
said that earlier.
I know. You're so right. Look, I think we have to understand, like, our friends are still people we negotiate with. Like, we don't just give them everything they want. It's in the.
Dow's answer.
I know. And as much as I love a lot of these advocacy groups and unions and organizations, and yet it's a negotiation. And the fundamental thing that we're negotiating towards is better outcomes for people. And we can't sacrifice at the altar of a good deal for our political partners an actual product that is good for people. That's a hot take. It's probably why I'll never be in elected office. That's my genuine belief.
I mean, so I work for 7 teachers unions around the country. And some of my less progressive friends say, well, they fight for bad teachers. We all know who the bad teacher is, and they're standing up for them. And well, that teacher paid dues into the union, and they're entitled to representation too,
Right.
and you're misunderstanding what the point of a labor union is and an association. And, they need to have somebody that has their back, with a lawyer and legally. And you have to understand their role. And you could disagree with that bad teacher, quote unquote.
Right.
But it doesn't mean that role doesn't need to be played. And to understand what everybody's role is in the ecosystem. And then that's okay.
I'm going to take another question. I saw a hand here.
Hey, gentlemen. First of all, if you'd like to fill attention, I welcome you to caucus anytime. Please do join us. Speaking of an ecosystem, you both get paid for your opinions and to direct candidates who then win races. And in my experience, consultants are very focused on winning or losing at the ballot. So, what accountability or responsibility do you feel for your candidates' behaviors once they actually are in office and enact policy?
I think that's a fair question, and it's something I struggle with personally. There are candidates that I have not taken on because they're too far away from my personal views. However, if you do that too much, you don't have any clients. So so you have to, you have to be careful. I mean, like your firm does Fetterman and MGP and some people that are a little different than your Seattle clients, and I've worked for people that are a little out of step with my personal views. And so it's a challenge, it is fundamentally a challenge. And, like I don't work for anybody that's anti-choice. I don't work for anybody that's anti-gay. I have my lines that I don't cross. Some things are a little grayer, and I have to limit it to that. I don't work for anybody that's anti-union. That's the other thing, and you can view that as what under the lens as what you will. And I've not taken on people a second time. Like you went in there and did something bad. I used to represent David Sawyer in Olympia, and then when he went down there and did bad things, I exited stage left. So.
Yeah, I think about it pretty similarly. I mean, you mentioned Fetterman. That's an example of a client we worked for when he first ran as a progressive. And then once he got into elected office, I won't opine on why, did not turn out that way, and we dropped him as a client. I think all of us struggle with this exact question. For me, the through line for my work is it's my belief in a big tent party, ultimately, that I want to work for the people that I think are the most representative of the community that they're running in. That's the through line for me, and it's why I don't lose any sleep over these races. Doesn't mean I don't feel any consternation over them. I disagree virulently with a lot of my clients on politics all the time, and yet the through line for me is I feel like they are the best representative of their district that I can make happen. If I am wrong, I am happy to be wrong. Right? Like if somebody else can win, and this is actually I'm just bringing us back to the point, like I don't find it offensive at all that somebody runs against Marie Perez or Adam Smith or Marilyn Strickland or Chris Pappas or Mara Sullivan, like Deb Holland, like all of my clients, like it's not offensive to me at all. I think if you can win, if you can better represent this community, like I will knock on doors for you tomorrow, the day you beat me, because I want to win that district. I'm doing what I think is right. I'm doing what I think can get us that vote in Congress. If I'm wrong, I will be the first volunteer on your docket. That is my mentality about it, and I get it if people don't love that.
I'll give you an example. I got hired by a New York group that wanted to save Republicans in Nebraska that were anti-death penalty. Nebraska has a unique legislature, which they're unicameral, one house, and they're all nonpartisan. So these races were all anti-death penalty Republicans versus pro-death penalty Republicans, and they were all Republicans. They were horrible on every other issue. But it's kind of like, well, looking at the choices, this person sucks and this person sucks less. Okay, that's okay with me. So it's again representing their community. It's figuring out, is that a choice that's okay with your values? And even if I was there myself, I don't think I'd agree with 100% of my own vote. So so you do your best.
And then I just want to end
Take us
with
to
this.
the next question.
Okay, yeah. All right, I'll just wait then. Go
Okay.
ahead.
I want to make sure we have our next question go forward in the back.
It's really nice to hear talking about party structures, door knocking, and everything. I have a saying that in Seattle, there are only 2 people that vote in Seattle. A million people could vote in Seattle, but at the end of the day, there are only 2 major voters, The Stranger and Seattle Times. So when we talk about door knocking or party structure or even policies and everything, how do you break? And it's something I want you all to address with boldness. it's not wrong to call out the media. How do you now tell people to break away from the two major voters in Seattle so that, because they played a major role in whoever we have in Olympia, whoever we have in City Council, whoever we have in King County. How do you address that now in this day and age?
Woo boy.
Great question.
Sure, I'll do it. Look, I think this goes back to a point I made before, which is that borrowed power is always just borrowed power. And as a progressive community, we've been too lazy in letting other people make decisions that we need to make for ourselves. We've been too complacent in letting single newspapers cheat sheet be a replacement for knocking on doors and raising money and talking to our neighbors. And, is this the year that breaks? I have no idea. I will just say, at the end of the day, voters vote, not papers. And yeah, typically it's made a big impact. I'll go to the mat and see if we can change that, And I just think my pitch to everyone is take over your own agency. And this isn't about the stranger. The stranger is whatever it is. To me, this is about everything that I've been trying to talk about. As a Democratic Party, I think we have taken too many shortcuts. We have just been in some ways it's I want to complain about the decisions that labor unions make, but I haven't put my money where my mouth is. I'm still relying on their money to win any race in this city. So who am I to complain at the hand that feeds me, right? Until I put my money where my mouth is and I try to change it my damn self. And I think that's what this comes down to me. It's a reckoning about, there's a salience in the party right now that we're subservient to just a handful of individual stakeholders, corporations, individuals, unions, special interests. If we want to change that, it's going to be a lot of work to do it. But I think the upside is, the place I want to end personally, is I am not interested in a party that is pushing for 218 votes in the House or 50 votes in the Senate. I want a party that can win 60 votes in the Senate and 280 votes in the House. I am pushing for a party that is stronger than one decision maker. I don't want it to be one point of failure, that if one individual political director says, oh, I don't know, I've got other priorities this year, that suddenly we can't act. To me, that's nonsense. And I think we've all just called the question on our own complacency. Maybe we're satisfied with it, and we prefer to just diffuse our responsibility to somebody else. I think ultimately this is a real test of that, and we'll see. And I think that's a question that Seattle is going to grapple with, and who knows? In any other city I work in, this wouldn't even be a question. There's no powerful force like this in Portland, Oregon, right? But it is something that's unique here, and I like to think Seattle's not so exceptional that it's unique that one paper will always have power or the other paper will always have power. I think it can conform to the same political realities that literally every other city in this country conforms to.
And there's also 4 newspapers in Portland, why do they have more for half the population, which is kind of crazy. But, thinking about that question, and it's very interesting because, I don't know about legislature, but for city council and mayor, if you didn't get the Seattle Times or a stranger, you didn't get through, for the large extent, with one notable exception, which was Teresa Mosqueda.
Right.
And she beat that system. And do you know why? Because she actually ran a real campaign, and she had real support and real organizing. I mean, she came out of labor and was an amazing labor union organizer, and she busted and did it and came out of that primary.
Yep.
And I have a lot of respect for her and admiration for her for doing it. But by and large, they, the Politburo on the left and Politburo on the right have picked our candidates. And sometimes in the general, one wins, sometimes the other wins. And I think it's a little absurd, but you're right. And no other major city in America does this exist except here.
Yeah.
And I think that takes us to time. So everyone, can we give it a hand to Stephen and Dean?